All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Ted Lemon. It's June 6, 2022, and we're joining via Zoom today. Ted, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate this. First question to get you started is why wine?
Because you don't have to wear a tie. Pretty much. I was a French literature major who, like many, liberal arts kids, didn't know what to do with myself. And I'd had the good fortune of spending half a year at the Université de Dijon before it became the Université de Bourgogne, and had taken a wine appreciation class there. The gentleman who ran it said to me, you know what, if you ever want to do a harvest in Burgundy, let me know and I'll help you find something. And after graduating, I was like, or when I was graduating, I was like, why not? Who could possibly, turn down the opportunity to go work a harvest in the vineyards, even if you end up doing something completely unrelated? So I said, yes, I'll come back. And I did.
So you had no background in wine. What was the experience like for you?
Yeah, no, I had no background at all in wine. I was a liberal arts major, and I just thought it would be interesting to try. And I was lucky enough to get a scholarship, a postgrad scholarship from college to do this. Don't ask me how I conned them into giving me one, but I did. So I knew I had the money to survive, even if it was going to be all volunteer work for a year or 6 months or whatever it would be. And so I was able to do it, to go over there. There was only one problem, Rich, which is that in the interim, François Mitterrand had been elected the first socialist president of France since the war on a full employment for the French platform. So by the time I got there in August of 1980, no one wanted to hire any American under any circumstances because of this issue. So I ran into a few problems at that point, and was really striking out left and right. But I was fortunate enough through this contact to get the number of Jacques Cess at Domaine du Jacques. And that was simply because this gentleman said to me, why don't you try Jacques Cess at Dujac? His wife is American. Maybe he knows what happens to Americans in Burgundy. And of course, at this time, there were still telephone booths. And so I literally went to a telephone booth, and this was my last phone call. I didn't know what I was going to do if this didn't come through, and was able to get Roz Cess on the phone, and made sure to speak only in French with her so that she knew that I was fluent. It was very important. And went down to see her, and then she said yes. As a matter of fact, my husband's in Paris. He's had a major issue with sciatica, and I'm back operation, and we are suddenly finding ourselves desperately in need of help. So I said, well, I'll do it.
When you said that, what did you envision you would be doing? What was your impression of the work you would be doing?
There wasn't any. I was willing to do anything. That was not an issue. I think I knew I'd be spending some time in the vineyards. That was number one. And then in the cellar, because at that time, Dujac was a little smaller. The boys were very young. Jeremy was 5. Alec was probably 3, I'm guessing. Paul was, a year old or something like that. And so Jacques really didn't have a cellar team, right? It was just Jacques and then a couple of the vineyard guys who really didn't know much about the cellar. And so he needed someone in the cellar who could be more, could communicate better with him on a more, for lack of a better word, intellectual basis, right? And so that was really my role during harvest. Jacques was in bed most of harvest and was only able to get out of bed a couple of times. And I would take wine samples to his bedside, and then he'd tell me what to do. And that's kind of how we managed to make it through the 80 vintage.
What were your impressions of the work itself as you started to do it? What was your impression of vineyard work and of the cellar? Did you enjoy it immediately? Was it a learning curve for you?
Oh yeah, no, I enjoyed it immediately. Absolutely. I was pretty much hooked right away. Yeah. You know, it was a very different time in Burgundy. Obviously, it was much more closed at that time and much less open to outsiders, which isn't to say that the cesses weren't open. It was the opposite, obviously. But it was a very, very different time culturally in Burgundy than today. And so I feel very fortunate to have seen that culture, not an easy culture by any means all the time or in many ways, but really a chance to have met and gotten to know people who had grown up during or been in their young adulthood during the really difficult years of the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, when, you know, people were barely making a living in Burgundy. So having had the opportunity to meet those people and taste with them and that sort of thing was really you know, I look back on it, it's a real privilege and an honor to have done that.
So I'm curious about learning wine for you, the education process, both sort of your palate and of the work itself. What was the process for you? What did you find worked the best, and what did you find most enjoyable about learning about wine?
I think the complexity of it was a big factor for me. I was very much interested in the fact that it's this amazing combination of tradition and culture, you know, science, chemistry, plumbing, electrical work, you name it. All of those things, I really enjoyed the diversity of it. Was a big factor for me.
So after the first harvest, what came next for you?
So I stayed at Dujac for 8 months and working full time. And then Jacques was kind enough to say to me, you know, you should really, he got me into the university in the enology program doing the short course at that time, because he said, you know, you really should have the introduction to enology. I had no interest in doing the Diplôme National. I wasn't going to spend 5 years, but you know, I thought I should know at least the short course stuff, the Cliff Notes version, so to speak. And so I did that concurrently. And then he really encouraged me to go work for other people because he said, you need to see what other people do. And so I spent a month or 6 weeks each working for Jean-Marie Lumière, Christophe's dad. Christophe was at the army that year. I worked for Domaine Parent and Pommard. I worked for Bruno Claire, who had just started in less than 5 years before. I mean, I don't know, it'll be on the website, but Bruno was just getting going with his own estate. So that was really fun to see what Bruno was doing. I worked for Aubert de Vilaine down in Bouzeron. Again, just to really get the flavor of these estates and see how they functioned, what their culture was, what differences they might have from Dujac in the way they farmed, or you know, how they thought about wine, all of those things.
What were your impressions of the culture there, of the wine culture? What was it like at that point, and what were the wines like as you were tasting them?
So there were a couple of things that are important, I think, to know. That is that the number of really top estates was smaller then. I think that there's no question overall that there's more estates producing better wine in Burgundy today than there was in 1980. And most of those people knew each other, right? They were either friends or they were more than acquaintances. They talked to each other, they exchanged information, they were more open than most of Burgundy was. So that's one thing that was particular to that world that I got introduced to, as opposed to being at some little old vignerons who, you know, really was from true peasant stock and had never emerged much beyond the, you know, the tiny estate that they might have run. So that's really sticks out to me from that period of time. And you're also dealing a period of time where the great boom had not yet happened. And so people forget this, or there's young people, there's no reason they would be aware of this. But the 70s in terms of wine quality in Burgundy were pretty miserable, right? I mean, if you look at the vintage vintages. 70 was okay, 71 was maybe better and depended on the wine. 72 was thin and uninteresting. 73 was worse. 74 was worse than that. 75 was absolutely forgettable. It's finally 76. You hit a great vintage. 77, a lot of wine, pretty thin. 78, another great vintage. 79, a large vintage of decent quality. So there was a lot of Burgundy in the market. There was a lot of Burgundy to sell. There was a lot of Burgundy to buy. And it was not an easy time in that sense for people. And so when I first got there in 80, these are the vintages being sold, right? People were thrilled to have had 78, 76 had gotten through the marketplace. But it wasn't easy. It was not an easy time.
So at that time, as you're meeting all of these people, seeing all of these places, were you starting to think this was something you wanted to do long term? At what point did that become more of a future for yourself?
Yeah, I thought that I felt as if, Rich, I had this amazing experience. Obviously, I couldn't get a visa. I didn't have a way to get a visa or anything. And as I said, Burgundy was a lot more closed then than it is today. And so I felt like, well, I've done it. I've had my great experience. I'll head home and see what happens. And so I stepped out of the business for a year to try to write the great American novel, which I'm happy to say I failed to do. At the end of that year of trying to do something different, I was like, okay, no, I'll go back to the wine business. And so I met Josh Jensen at Calera, who was a good friend of Jacques. And Josh, a wonderfully welcoming, warm human being, said, yeah, sure, come on, do the harvest with us. And so I went out and did the harvest of 82 at Calera. And of course, Steve Dorner was still there at that time. And that was a lot of fun. We had a great year there. And it was also, I think, we'd have to check with Randall Graham, but I think it was the first year that Randall made wine, and Randall made wine at Calera. And he made Pinot Noir, and he was not happy with the results, and that made him decide to veer off in the whole Rhone Ranger direction. His disappointment with what he was seeing from what he was trying at Calera, which wasn't Calera fruit, right? It was other sources. But it was a lot of fun to have Randall there at the same time. It was great.
So then at that point, were you thinking again? Are you thinking like, this is my path now? I'm going to be a winemaker. I'm gonna start my own thing, or are you still just sort of dabbling?
Yeah, I didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, I'd never been to California. I never set foot out west. Not the California West. I'd been, to the Rockies and all that sort of thing. But so it was a new culture, a new place, and so very different. It was also an interesting time because Dick Graff was still alive, and the Chalone group had yet to expand dramatically. And so they had a small winery technical group, which included Chalone and Calera and Mount Eden, and I think Ventana Vineyards, which is an old name people may remember. Rick Foreman was in that group also at that time. And so it was a great introduction to those people. And again, I felt very fortunate, Rich, because I saw sort of the last, I think, really great years of Chalone. When Chalone, and I apologize to current ownership if you don't like that description, but it was a different place, much smaller, very focused on the high end, and really produced some amazing wines, Chenin Blanc, Chardonnay, Pinot, really terrific wines. And so getting the opportunity to see that and to meet Dick and Peter Graff. And this was right when I think 1980 was right about when Jeffrey Patterson started at Mount Eden. So Jeffrey was either brand new or a year or 2 years into his stewardship there. So there'd been a big change at Mount Eden also. I'm sure Ridge was part of that group, but I don't remember meeting Paul Draper.
So you mentioned first time in California, first time in the West. What were your impressions as you got there?
Certainly different from Burgundy, no question about that. My frustration at Calera was the separation of vineyards and winemaking, which I had, the reason I'd chosen Burgundy as opposed to going to Bordeaux was I couldn't wrap my mind around this idea that you'd have a maître de chai on one side or a winemaker on one side and a chef de culture or a vineyard manager on the other. It seemed like the two things should be the same. They should be the same person. Of course, the technical director at the major chateaus now kind of fulfills that role. But anyway, in my mind, it should be the same person. And so the scale of Burgundy felt more appropriate to me. And I was a little frustrated seeing in California that there was more of that separation, or seemed to be more of that separation. And so I didn't know what I was going to do next, Rich. I had no idea. I got a phone call from, I think it was Jacques Cess saying, well, Guy Rouleau has passed away. And the Rouleaus are really casting about for what to do. Jean-Marc's, still working full time as an actor, young actor, of course, then in Paris. Would you be interested in coming back and giving them a hand? And as you can well imagine, of course, I said yes, be happy to. And so I, got on the plane as quickly as I could to go back.
So back in Burgundy, back in a place that you've been and a place that you say is more kind of conducive to the way you're viewing wine and vineyards at that time. What was the role as you got there, and how did the role change once you got started?
So there was a certain irony to this, because I had loved Guy Rouleau's wines when I worked for Jacques, and Jacques had a lot of the Rouleau wines in his cellar. And so I'd asked him, he said, where do you want to work? And pretty high up on the list was Rouleau. And so he called Guy. This was before Guy was sick, obviously. And Guy said to him, well, Jacques, I'd love to have him, but my crew is pretty old fashioned down here and pretty gruff and pretty tough, peasants, and they'd probably eat him alive. And so that didn't happen, but whatever it was, a year plus later, I showed up to be their boss. So that was an interesting experience. And it was, it was a combination of working. There were so many things at Rouleau that were so well managed, Rich. I mean, Guy was a very accomplished winemaker and property manager and vineyard manager. He really knew what he was doing. So it wasn't like walking into a situation that was remedial. That wasn't it at all. It was the opposite. It was more like, this boat is on a really great tack right now and is moving really fast. And all you got to do is keep it on that tack. So that was my job, was to oversee the winemaking part, the enological part, the vineyard part, working with the traditions that they had. And not really trying to change them. We tweaked things. I mean, we ended up doing the 1983 vintage, which is about as far of an outlier as you can possibly get, probably in Burgundy history. And so we had to adjust on a lot of things for 83. But Jean-Marc's mom was there full time, and Jean-Marc would come and see me, and we would chat about stuff and go over it and whatnot. But it was pretty rough and tumble. There's no question about that. This was a different culture, and it was the old way of doing things, for sure.
How did you feel that you were accepted there, given all of that as an American? How did you fit?
You had to prove yourself. You didn't fit. You didn't fit. You had to prove yourself. You had to be able to prune as fast in a row. You had to be able to do everything as fast or faster than everybody else. And so that was very difficult. I was a young man, so that helped. But I also didn't have 25 years of pruning experience, right? So you're in a situation where you got to man up and show that you're as fast as everybody else or better. And that was very challenging. It was very, very challenging. But that's okay. I think I learned a lot from the experience, yeah, I think I understand what a gruff old Burgundian is. I'm pretty clear on that.
Maybe more than anyone. That's funny. So you mentioned the 1983 vintage is particularly challenging and a particular outlier, and that's right as you're getting started. So tell me about making those kinds of adjustments, and where does the knowledge come from? Where did the knowledge come from you? Where did the confidence come from for you to make those kinds of decisions in such a strange vintage?
I was very well supported by Jacques Cess and Aubert de Villaine and Patrick Bise of Savigny, those three in particular, and Bernard Michelot in Meursault, who was Guy's best friend. And those four people in particular were incredibly helpful and supportive, which was huge, to be able to bounce ideas and thoughts off them. But for young people who wouldn't have any idea about the vintage, it was a vintage, first of all, to put it in context, this period of time was the height of chemical farming in Burgundy. Burgundy is in a much better place today, Rich, than it was then. So people were spraying all kinds of cocktails all the time. And this particular vintage had a real problem with, and I can't even remember technically which insect it was. It was like tondeuse de la grappe, or anyway, it was a caterpillar inside the clusters, and there was a huge problem with rot in both red and white Burgundy, widespread, partly induced by weather, partly by the presence of the caterpillar. And so the wines went through the roof, or the grapes went through the roof in sugar, in a way that is just not traditional in white wine. As the botrytis formed, and we were, not even at 100 days, and sugars were zooming. And it was very controversial in Burgundy because everybody, tradition said you pick after the 100 days. And I'm looking at this stuff and going, it's right. We need to pick this. Well, 100 days, 100 days. But I'll never forget Bernard Michelot pounding on the table, saying to me at one point, saying, "Ted, it's 100 days. It's never less than 100 days." But it was less than 100 days in that instance. So very much an outlier vintage in which alcohols were high, so things did not want to finish fermenting. Very, very difficult challenge. Lots of oxidation issues. Wines that you would pull out of a barrel and put in a glass, and 5 minutes later it's brown. I mean, scary stuff. Really, really scary stuff. So really difficult to deal with in that way. Not as difficult as the reds, because the botrytis meant there was no color, and it was, making red Burgundies in 83 was even more challenging than whites, I think. But that's how it was an outlier.
So tell me about the progression of your time from then on in Burgundy after the first vintage. What came next for you, and how did your sort of role and expertise develop and grow?
Yeah, it certainly, I was able to settle in my relationships there. And as I gained respect from people, or the people I worked with specifically, so that became much, much easier. And what I began to see in my own mind was that in order for Rouleau to get to the next step in evolution, in quality evolution, Jean-Marc really needed to come home. Because, professional managers like I was, what are called gérants in French, there's only a handful in Burgundy. And the society was then, except for Lalou, Bise Leroy, and a few other women, was largely patriarchal, right? The man would run the society, the estate. And I saw that tradition, and I said to the Rouleaus, this is what you need, right? I mean, there's things we need to do to get Rouleau to the next step in its evolution. Guy has done amazing work, but it can get there. But, it's going to take the son doing them, not me as an outsider, because you're going to have trouble accepting. from an outsider. And so we had great discussions about that, but I came to my conclusion that I should move on. That I really, as great as it was and how wonderful it was to be so special in Burgundy as the only American winemaker, the only other person was Pascal Marchand from Canada. I was like, no, this is what they need, and I need to recognize that. And I looked around at other jobs in France, and like I said, there's not a lot of professional management positions then in France at all for in general, and even less for Americans. So after looking at a couple of opportunities, I said, you know what, I'll go to California. It's booming. I want to go see what's happening in Napa Valley, even if I don't stay there.
So you had left California, gone for a while, and now you're back, like you said, in the middle of a boom. What was different about it coming back to it?
Well, I really didn't know the North Coast, so that was a new discovery for me. I think it was also very fortunate in Napa because I moved there in '85, and this was really the last glimmer of what I would call rural farming Napa Valley. Now, people can complain about me saying that, which I would understand, but there was still that agrarian community feeling. There was a greasy spoon where everybody, ate in the morning after you'd done your frost protection in the spring, for instance. There were not the sort of upscale shops that there are now in St. Helena. It was just a very tail end of a different era as Napa began to boom, and I was fortunate enough to just catch that, and was fortunate enough to get a job where I could be both vineyard manager and winemaker, which I thought was really essential. And that was up on Howell Mountain for a place at the time called Chateau Voltner, which was purchased by the former owners of La Mission Aubryon in 1983. I think they purchased it, 83, 84. I can't remember now. I'd have to go back and look. But this is a beautiful property on Howell Mountain that Rick Foreman actually wanted to purchase himself, but said to me, I can't afford it. It's too big for me. So that's why I mentioned it to the Voltner family, who he had known from Bordeaux from visiting them. And so it was all Chardonnay at the beginning, which I was not as keen on for Howell Mountain, although I thought it'd be different and interesting. But the plan was to plant Cabernet long term. And what I was really interested was this combination of working with Rick Foreman on Cabernet Sauvignon and Henri Lagardère, who had been the winemaker at La Mission for 40 years. And that was a combination I was really interested in.
You came back to the point there about being both vineyard manager and winemaker, and how important that was to you to see those two as one person in charge of both. Were there others around with a similar role, or was that fairly unique at that time and when you were getting started there?
Not many. Can't really think, other than people who owned their own property. Randy Dunn, right, who was less than 2 miles away. Randy was pretty much doing everything, but it was unusual in Napa Valley for sure. And I really felt strongly about it. I really wanted to do both. And so I stayed there for 7 years approximately. And then, and this is the part which gets more interesting for your subject matter, perhaps, and I'm happy to, answer other questions, but I do want to work our way there. By the early 90s, I had moved from a position in which, well, let me back up, Rich. Imagine that you've played baseball for a year of your life, and all of a sudden you're starting for the New York Yankees. I don't want to overstate the opportunity or the position I was in Burgundy, but I'd gone from nowhere to the majors, basically overnight. And so my feeling leaving Burgundy was, oh my God, you've worked with these among the most incredible vineyard sites in the world. You'll never be able to own something like that. So you're going to be somebody's hired gun for the rest of your life because I don't have any money and I don't have a family fortune. But by the early 1990s, that had begun to change. I had begun to feel a little bit differently, a little more interested in being a pioneer. I had visited Oregon. I had visited Anderson Valley. I'd seen parts of the Sonoma Coast. I really had opened in a lot of ways to doing and seeing different things. And I, thanks largely to two people I just mentioned, Rick Foreman and Randy Dunn, who really said to me, look, just do it. Just start your own thing. Don't worry about how big it is or how much it is. Just figure out where you want to go and get started.
So before you get to that, I'm curious about the farming specifically aspect of your work. Tell me about, you mentioned you're in Burgundy at a very highly chemical farming time. When you're in Napa, or as you're sort of developing your philosophy, had you started to come around to a different kind of farming at this point?
Tiptoeing is the way I would describe it. We were fortunate enough in Napa with that summer dry climate to not have the disease pressure of Burgundy, that's for sure. But it was farmed conventionally at that time, and I began to work a little bit with organic cover crops. It was my first frustration with organics because I found that working with nitrogen fixing cover crops, you saw great results for a year or two, and then things kind of went back to where they were. And so that was kind of the first inkling that maybe I had to start thinking a little more deeply about alternative farming and what might make it work. But that didn't come till later, for sure.
So you have this advice that find a place and go do what you want to do. So tell me about that process then, as you're starting to think about that becoming a reality. Where were you thinking? Where did you look? And how did you end up landing where you did?
So my wife Heidi and I, not married at that time, but close to being married, spent a lot of the winter of 92, 93 traveling from literally the Canadian border to the Mexican border, looking at sites for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And my conclusion from that trip, unlike a lot of people, I think, was that there is no holy grail location for these varieties in the Western United States. I think that historically you could make a really good argument that Chalon and maybe Mount Eden had the greatest history for producing exceptional wines. But anybody could argue that point. There were, Au Bon Climat had just gotten started in 7 or 8 years before in Santa Maria, and Jim was making really lovely wines. There were some terrific wines being made, obviously by Williams and Sellium out on the Russian River Valley and parts of the Sonoma Coast. And you can extend that up to Oregon. I mean, if I put on my time traveling hat, who would have stood out to me in particular? I certainly thought what Cameron was doing was really interesting and very reflective of place. I liked Evesham Wood quite a bit. David Adelsheim was really my primary host during my multiple visits to Oregon. And it was really great to taste with David and see his stuff, to go see the Ponzi's. I never got to Irie, which was pretty funny because David Adelsheim kept trying to get me in to see the other David. And it was 3 different trips, I think. And Adelsheim, who of course knew David very well, apologized profusely he said, "I'm trying, Ted. I just can't get you in the door. David's famous for being a bit of a curmudgeon." And finally, the last time I think I was in Adelsheim kitchen with him, and David Adelsheim said, "Here, you talk to him." And so I got on the phone with David Lett, and we start talking, and David said to me, well, Ted, why exactly do you want to come here? And I laughed and I just said, David, I'd just like to see what you're doing and learn, just like I would if I went to go see a new cellar in Burgundy. Didn't help, never got in the door.
You mentioned some of the places here that stood out to you. What did you sort of think in general about Oregon's wine industry and the wines and the people at that time?
Very highly. So what I was trying to say was that I felt like there was really great wine being made all over, and that the potential was really exceptional throughout the West Coast. What really, the things that really intrigued me about Oregon were, it was young, but not that young. And what I mean by that was that because that history, although tiny, went back to the 60s, and because of the work of David Lett and David Adelsheim, the Ponzis, and you know, a whole bunch of Eraths and all these other people, you could really get a sense, I thought, of what the potential was in Oregon. That was much more difficult, Rich, in what became the Sonoma Coast, or the true Sonoma Coast, or in Anderson Valley. You just couldn't see as clearly, because I think the sophistication and the knowledge of the Letts, the Ponzis, the Adelsheim, and these were really well-educated, thoughtful people who had visited a new Burgundy well and had thought a lot about what they wanted to do and why in Oregon. And so that was really, I loved that part of it. And I loved the sense of community, which was really strong. And there were a couple of people I can remember, I think it was Ken Wright at one point said to me, you know, when we were still trying to figure out what we wanted to do, you know, come on up here, Ted, you belong here. And it was such a sweet thing, because I certainly felt that really strong sense of camaraderie and community with people in Oregon. So those aspects really, it felt like, you know, like watching pioneers, but not quite being one, right? Because they already had done that. The pioneering had happened, and there had been some really brilliant wines produced, but you didn't have to quite be the person who figured out whether it was possible.
So with that said, you obviously didn't end up in Oregon. So why did you end up choosing where you did, and what was sort of the idea as you were getting started?
Sure. So the process of elimination is simplest for me. I'm not really a Southern California kind of guy. So just culturally, as much as I enjoy the wines of Santa Maria, or what was then Santa Barbara and became the Santa Rita Hills, wasn't really my kind of place. I had a lot of concerns about the sizes of the properties, Rich, that, you know, there was obviously a landed gentry that owned a lot of this land, and I didn't see how I'd ever be able to buy a little tiny bit of it. So I had that concern, whether well-founded or not, doesn't matter. I wasn't much interested in Carneros Pinot Noir. I never had been. I just found the wines nice, but not inspiring. So I wasn't much interested in that. Chalon, Calera, fine, but awfully hot to me, awfully warm area. I'd long since lost any sense that Pinot Noir had to be on limestone. So I had no limestone prejudice at all about it. And so it really came down to what I call the true North Coast, or Oregon. And as I began to look around and I looked at the geologic diversity of the North Coast, I was like, okay, this is more true pioneering. I mean, you're going to be a first generation here, but that's also an opportunity. And so I was like, that geologic diversity interests me. The fact that you're less than 40 miles from the most famous wine region in the United States, and it's virtually unknown for grapes, I thought was really interesting. I had a base of people I knew, a support group I knew in Napa and Sonoma. I thought I could get some consulting work. There was not a lot of consulting work in Oregon at that time, virtually none. So I had a concern about how I was going to pay the bills in Oregon. So that's how we made that decision. We looked at some specific properties in Oregon that I was quite excited about. I got to tell you the story of one because you'll get a kick out of it. Yeah, it just came down to those things. Culturally, it was a disappointment because I certainly was much closer to the culture of Oregon than I was to Napa Valley. And there was no winemaking culture on the Sonoma Coast because it was just coming into being. And it's one of the things that people forget is we knew a lot more about Oregon in 1990 than we did the Sonoma Coast. And that's easily forgotten, that Oregon was much more established. Not compared to the Russian River, of course, but talking about the Russian River and the Sonoma Coast in the same breath is something we don't do around here. They're two completely different entities. So
you have an Oregon property story to share.
Yeah, so we looked at a property in the Dundee Hills that was for sale that was quite high up, which was, I think it was the name of the family, you may know this, but it was Fuqua was the name of this property. And I really liked it. And I thought it had real potential. And I'm like, oh boy, it wasn't expensive. House needed being fixed up. It was a pretty funky old house, but Heidi and I really thought seriously about it. We ended up not doing it. But the reason it's a funny story is because I was the original consultant for Archery Summit, right? And so we made the 93 and 94 vintages down here in Napa. Those wines were a lot less new oak than the Archery Summit style became later. But it was really fun to do that and to sort of help Gary Andrus get Archery Summit off the ground. So all of the original vineyard plantings for what became the Red Hills Estate and Arcus were done by me. Those were all rootstock clonal combinations that I laid out for Gary on the various sites. And so I spent a lot of time in Oregon. But when we were early on in the Archery Summit process and they hadn't yet purchased any land, Gary said, I have a piece of property I want you to look at. And he started describing it to me. And I said, oh, you want to show me Fuqua? And he said, what? And I said, yeah, you're talking about Fuqua. He's like, how the hell do you know that? Well, that's the reason I knew it, is because we'd looked at it. I said, I don't need to go look at it. You should buy it. I'm happy to go up there and have another look, but you should buy it. That's a great piece of dirt.
That's awesome. I love that. So tell me about, well, I'm gonna come back to Archery Summit in a second, but tell me about once you had sort of honed in on Sonoma and on the North Coast, as you said, an unknown area at the time, which is kind of mind-boggling to think about. What were you looking for in terms of land there, and what was in your mind, what was the project going to be? What were you going to create there?
Well, I didn't know. We had to start small since we couldn't own land. I felt in this particular instance, again, because it was less understood. I mean, I love the Eola Hills. I don't want to not mention the Eola Hills because we made a couple, I think it was 2 vintages of wine from Temperance Hill at Archery Summit those first 2 years. So I spent a lot of time at Temperance Hill. Of course, Christum existed at that point, and Steve and I were very good friends. So we were very high on Seven Springs. There was a lot of stuff about the Eola Hills I liked as much, if not more, than the Red Hills of Dundee. But in any event, the thing about down here that was different is that nobody knew this land. Right, so no one could say, well, Eola Hills is like this and the Red Hills of Dundee are like that, to oversimplify, which we all do all the time. you couldn't really speak that way. Nobody could say, well, Casadero's like this and Occidental's like that, because the number of vineyards out there was tiny. And there was no way to quantify those things. So I felt very strongly about not owning land. So we looked at a parcel right next to Marquesan, where Helen Turley had purchased with her husband, John Wetlaufer. And we went out there and looked at it with Helen and John. And I just was too soon. I didn't want to own anything. I wanted to be able to really spend 10 years or so sort of investigating the area before we actually purchased, which I don't think I would have felt, as I said, in Oregon, because I felt a much stronger sense of where the good spots were, which was another reason that made me nervous to stay on the Sonoma Coast, because it was like, well, nobody knows.
So in that time exploring, what did you find? What excited you about what you were finding, and what did you see as the potential of that area?
The backstory to this is that there was a tasting group of winemakers in Calistoga in the 1980s that tasted only Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and nothing else. And the people who were in that tasting group were Tony Soter, Bert Williams, Helen Turley, David Ramey. I'm blanking, but there were a bunch of other people who were really great winemakers. And it was really fun to taste wine and to taste wines from all over. So you drop one Oregon into a lineup of Burgundy, or you drop one Burgundy into a lineup of Oregon, or John Wetlaufer did all of the organizing of this. And so it was really fun. Or you'd have a producer pair, you got two Dujaks in there, go see if you can find them. But what was most interesting to me about this tasting group was that there were not many wines from the Sonoma Coast, but the ones that were there certainly belonged in that group. And so for me, Rich, wine is a conversation. And so if you're talking about inexpensive wine, house wine, it's a conversation, just like if you're talking about the best wines in the world. And for me, I don't really care what the ranking is of the best wines of the world. I'm not really interested in whether you ranked, A first and C second and B third. I'm really much more interested in whether a wine belongs in a conversation. Is it of sufficient quality and distinction and complexity that it belongs in the discussion of the great wines of the world? And there were certainly a couple of wines we had from the Sonoma Coast which absolutely belonged in the discussion of the best of Oregon or the best of Burgundy. And so to me, that's what mattered. That's the way I saw it. And so having tasted a few of those things, I was like, yeah, no, I think there's the potential there, if you can find the right site and work with it. Which of course is the big if, because you don't know it, right?
So take me through the timeline then, from sort of landing in the Sonoma Coast as the area you want to work to starting Littorai, and how the project came about, and sort of the evolutionary steps along the way.
Yeah, so our first vintage was 93. We started with one Pinot Noir and one Chardonnay. We had decided that it was going to be what we called the true North Coast, the string bean along the coast of the Mendocino and Sonoma counties, which basically in Mendocino meant Anderson Valley, the only valley that opens to the ocean in Mendocino County, right? Most of inland Mendocino is landlocked or mountain locked, I guess would be the better description. So it was a relatively narrow band, probably less than 15 miles wide at the widest, that we were really interested in. And we called it the true North Coast because for us, it wasn't just the true Sonoma Coast, it was also the Mendocino Coast. And so we started with one wine from Anderson Valley and one wine from the Sonoma Coast, a Chardonnay from Mays Canyon, and a Pinot Noir from the Vineyard, which we called 1 Acre, which we now own, and just grew as we could. So in in '94, we came to Hirsch at the same time that, oh, Steve Kistler was in that group. I didn't mention Steve. Steve Kistler was in the tasting group. So Steve Kistler, Bert Williams, and I all came to Hirsch in February of '94, chose different blocks that we all wanted to, you know, get fruit from or share or whatever it might have been, depending on the specific block. So we just found things little by little as they became available. And that's what sort of allowed us to build up the breadth of experience to have a better sense of where we might want to actually purchase land. And so that first purchase was not until 2000 at a site that was not developed, which we call the Haven, which is about 2 miles northwest of Occidental, 3 miles from the ocean, about 1,300 feet in elevation. And then in 2004, 2003 came the Pivot, which we own, which is where the winery is located. And that's where all the biodynamic farming has really been developed from there. And then after that, we bought the 1 acre site in 2016. And there were a bunch of leases along the way. We leased, 30-year lease on Tyriad, 25-year lease on Roman Vineyard in Anderson Valley, a few of those things. And still today, about 50% grower wines and 50% owned or long-term lease.
With the first wines you made in '93 and '94 in that era, what did you think of the wines you're creating, and what was the response from consumers to the wines you were making?
I was very aware, Rich, that the dominant media style was not a style that we wanted to make. And so that was part of why I sort of lost interest in Archery Summit, was because the wines became a little more oak driven and a little maybe flashier at that period of time than I would have liked. And so the question was, if you know that the party boat is leaving the dock over there and you're not on the party boat and you don't want to be on the party boat, how are you going to make a living? How are you going to pay the bills? And so we went directly, what we did is we imitated what was done in Burgundy in the 1930s. In other words, when the negociants stopped purchasing wine with the Depression, all these growers like Ramonet and Gouge, etc., started bottling their own wine. I mean, a few had obviously bottled it before then, but some of the finest estates started bottling their own wine and selling it. And so they went to the restaurants of Paris, Pierre Ramonet among them, went to Paris and said, will you buy my wine? And that's how they began selling their wine. And so that's what we decided to do with the sommelier community in the United States, starting in New York and California, was tell the story and say, if this is something that you're interested in, I sure hope you'll buy the wine. It was that simple. Trying to work really with the Somm community.
And what was their response to it? Because as you said, it's going against sort of the dominant style at the time. Were they excited about what you're doing? Did they see the potential? Were they on board, or was it a harder sell?
No, I think we were really lucky. I mean, the brilliant thing about starting small is, Rich, you don't need that many fans. You don't have to worry about it too much. You got to find a sucker or two out there, right? So we were able to find them, and a lot of people understood it and were excited about it. And so we were able to grow as our market grew. And we were very fortunate that we had some really important buyers in those early years. French Laundry began the same year we did. So we had a real connection to the French Laundry. It was still the glory days of Oriole in New York. Le Marché still existed in New York. Rubicon in San Francisco. I wish I could say there was all kinds of support from Portland, but I can't say that was the case. I had to tease you about that one. Anyway, we went to those restaurants and were able to build a clientele little by little, trying to tell that story of a little more restraint, less new oak, hopefully wines that would age, but nobody knew. Again, we knew more about Oregon's ability to age than we did the Sonoma Coast. There's no question.
You were a little ahead of your time for Portland, I'm sorry to say. You'd be a huge hit right now, I bet, though.
Yeah, it's a different time. Portland's a different city, as you said.
It's true. It's true.
I'm not sure either is better, by the way, but that's a whole other conversation.
So you brought up Archery Summit again there. I want to kind of get back to that. How did that come to be? How are you the person that ended up being part of that? And what were the kind of the early days of Archery Summit like from your perspective?
So Gary and I we were good friends down here during the time I was working in Napa. So when he was interested in starting Archery Summit, he said, "Look, I really don't know anything about Pinot, you got to help me out here." And so I said, "Sure." And so I started working with him, and it was certainly, pilot winemaking in the best sense, but hopefully with the best fruit. We worked with Weber in the Dundee Hills. I mentioned Temperance Hill. So we were trying to different parts of the Willamette Valley to see what the quality potential was. And once it was clear that they were ready to pull the trigger on doing the winery, then that's when it really got fun, because then of course we had the home estate to develop, along with the design of the winery and all that sort of thing, which was a lot of fun to work on, and a little scary because you're drilling a cave in Oregon and you just see how much moisture is coming out of the walls. It's like, wow, this is really tough conditions under which to dig a cave. But it was a lot of fun. We spent a lot of time tasting all over the Willamette Valley. We spent a lot of time in Burgundy tasting. I felt pretty comfortable about the clonal and rootstock selections. I was less at ease, Rich, about the question of spacing for Oregon, because you do have, much like California, and in some ways more, you do have that completely charged, in the old days, soil moisture profile, right? Where you go into June and the spurt of growth with a lot of soil moisture, more than Burgundy would normally see. And so you get really active, vigorous growth. And, looking closely at Drouhin, whether they knew we were looking closely or not, and seeing the amount of growth in some of the really tight spacing, I wasn't convinced that was the best choice for Oregon. So we felt like meter by meter might be fun to do as an experiment, but yeah, we should probably be a little wider to give the vines obviously a little more room to express the vigor. And I think that was a good choice. I think there's some other things about it, the early choices we made, where the spacing probably should have been not quite as tight. But I think in terms of rootstocks, they were overall pretty decent choices. And I know that Archery Summit has done a bunch of modifications to spacing, et cetera, since, which I certainly would have done too. But it was a lot of fun, and it was really, and clonally, in terms of clonal selection, that I felt very comfortable about, Rich, because we knew what had been brought into Oregon before. I'd had experience with these clones in Burgundy. So the whole Dijon family thing made perfect sense to me. I didn't have any questions about that. And in terms of heritage clones, there wasn't as much available other than Pomard and Wädenswil, which were fine, and we were totally interested in using. We just didn't want them to dominate the mix because we weren't convinced yet.
So tell me a little bit about Gary Andrus, obviously a pretty notorious character in Oregon wine history, and one that we never had the chance to meet, unfortunately. From your memory, what prompted him to want to be here and make Pinot and Chard in the first place? And what were some of your maybe interesting moments, memories, or stories of him in Oregon?
Yeah, I think one thing that really was important to Gary was he wanted to have a clear regional break from the winery in Napa. And he felt very strongly that Oregon gave them that, the sufficient distance from Napa. Whereas the Sonoma Coast or Mendocino, I think he felt like it was the stories would be too blurred, and he wanted very distinct, separate stories. And he loved challenges. This is a man that loved, this is a man who was full of life and a lot of fun to be with, who liked challenges, who liked things that were different. And so I think he really felt like he could see that distinction, and he could have wineries that really had their own entity, right? That it wouldn't be, by being in Oregon, it would not be an appendage of Pine Ridge. And I think that was smart. I think that was very, very smart, because there was no question from a wine quality point of view that it would work. It was just a question of, how does this fit into your overall business? So fun stories with Gary, there were a lot, some of which can't be mentioned in a recording, but I think he had come to see me in Burgundy back in the early 80s before we knew each other. And he said, let's go out to a restaurant. So I took him to a Chinese restaurant. And I think he never forgave me for that. I think that's part of the reason he needed to seek revenge in some way on me. The other thing was Sam Tannehill, right? That Sam had spent a harvest working for me, and I was convinced that Sam had a great future in the wine business. And so I said to Sam, it's going to be a wild ride with Gary, but if you're interested in this, I think you should take this opportunity, because I think that even if you only do it for a few years, you're gonna see all kinds of things because of Gary's ambition. The nature of it is a new project, and I'm really glad that Sam decided to do that. I think it was a really great choice for him. And I'm sure Gary drove him pretty nuts during that period of time, which Sam may have discussed or been discreet about if he's talked to you. But I think it's a great decision. And I think they worked well together. I think Sam was very patient with Gary and all the demands.
So I want to back up a moment for you. You brought up biodynamics earlier. Obviously, one of the things you're most well known for. Tell me about at what point that became part of your thinking, and what encouraged you, what caused you to implement it in such a way as your property was growing and as your brand was growing.
So I'd farmed conventionally at that point for 20 years, 20 plus years, Burgundy, California, consulting around California, including the Santa Lucia Highlands and further afield, and Oregon, obviously, conventionally. And I just got to the point, Rich, where I had a naive question for myself. I say this all the time, that was important, which is, what does the forest know that I don't know? And what I mean by that is, obviously, from an ecological perspective, the forest has achieved a state of dynamic equilibrium, which, if we exclude climate change for a moment, should be sustainable for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so the forest has figured out how to sustain itself, and it doesn't need a bag of calcium nitrate. So the question for me was how do I mimic the forest in the vineyard? And so as I looked at it, my concern for the world of organic farming was that it could be seen as a substitution game. I just get rid of the synthetic phosphorus, and I substitute an organic form of the mineral. But I'm still living in that world of mineral fertilization, explaining how and why plants grow and reproduce. And that's what I'd lost confidence in. I really felt like if it explains part of it, it explains only a very small portion of how the plant world functions. And there's plenty of great organic farmers, what some people refer to as deep organic farmers, who don't just do a substitution game, but I'm just relating to you what I experienced at the time, not saying it was correct. And so I said to myself, well, biodynamics is a completely different thing. I'm 40 years old, 40 plus years old. This is a great time to have my ideas and beliefs shaken up. And so let's try it. And so when we decided to start Rich. There was none of this, spray a spray and see what happens. It was like 100%. And then if it doesn't work, you can go back and be the best organic farmers you can be, but you're not nibbling around the edges. Whether you believe it or not, you've got to give the system a chance. And so that's what we did starting in 2000 with the Haven, which was that first site. And then, within 6 months, I was starting to see things that made me say, yeah, we're going to continue and we're going to expand this. And so here we are 20 years later, 22 years later, and the only sites at Littorai that are not farmed biodynamically now are Savoy and Charles Heinz, both of which are farmed organically, but not BD, everything else. Well, and one other site for the Sonoma Coast blend. Everything else is farmed biodynamically.
You mentioned seeing quick results, quick progress. What were the initial things you saw that excited you about what you were doing, and how were there, once you kind of dove in and saw progress, were there obstacles, were there setbacks along the way that you had to kind of figure out how to deal with?
The one thing I saw that really excited me was, especially in California, in our completely summer dry climate, you hit late August and you've gone 3 months or more without a drop of rain. And yet I was seeing things germinate in the soils. You didn't have a lush cover crop by any means, but you had things germinating at a time where I'd never seen things germinating before. So that was a key. Grafting on the waxing moon was another thing that really we had tremendous success with. So all these little things, you can't turn them into randomized block trials and prove by any means, and I would never claim that you could, but all these indicators to me that this was working and that it was worth pursuing. And then after a few years, you become even more convinced of it because, you're really not doing anything more than basic organic inputs, and by that I mean sulfur, mineral oil, biological fungicides, and your vines are healthy and you've got less botrytis than conventional Chardonnay vineyards or whatever it might be. So that to me was, those things all added up.
What was the learning curve for you there? How long did it take you to feel comfortable with biodynamics, especially since it's such a sort of preventative rather than proactive rather than reactive type of thing? Did it take a while to get used to that?
I think some of the concepts are a challenge no matter how long you've been farming that way. And it's helpful to think about it like learning a foreign language. You just need to do a little bit of the monkey see, monkey do, and when the teacher comes in the morning and says bonjour, you can probably figure out that that means hello or good morning or something along those lines. So I think there's value to that, and then you piece together the understanding as you can yourself over time. But I never experienced. I mean, the challenges are around organization, right? How can you begin to make all of your own preparations, grow all of your own preparation plants? How can you put all these layers in the animals, the grazing of the animals, the vineyards, all this stuff together? And there's no one answer. It all depends on the individual farm and location and the region, because different regions have different ways of making compost work differently. I mean, we haven't mentioned this, but I consulted in New Zealand for 18 years, and we finally figured out how to make compost in New Zealand. It took us a while. Or at least in central Otago. And each region is different and it has its peculiarities, and you have to work towards an understanding of those. But it's really putting all the pieces in place rather than, oh shoot, I got terrible mildew this year. I think that happens when you completely give up any allopathic work, right? The great frustration of Vitis vinifera is that this is not a variety, or this is not a species native to our continent. And we're trying to take a foreigner and put it on our continent under very different conditions with a native pest or native disease in powdery mildew that Europe never had. And that Vitis vinifera did not, evolve to have a resistance to. And so as a result, you're going to be stuck with some forms of allopathy. You just have to You can't do, at least at this point, everything homeopathically or synergistically. And that, of course, that's a frustration. That'd be my one single greatest frustration. But I also have a friend who was a biodynamic consultant for many years, who's no longer with us, who said the other thing you have to realize about Vitis vinifera, Ted, and this also actually goes for the rootstocks that we all work with, since these things are basically clonally reproduced, you know, you're working with a photograph of a photograph of a photograph of a photograph, and just keep talking, right? So you're dealing with a very old, fragile person who at the same time has remarkable robustness and resistance. But it's a yin-yang relationship. It's got both those things at the same time. And this is the great benefit, I think, of the natural wine movement, is challenging all of our preconceived notions about hybrids or new crosses, trying to work towards less spray. And I think that part of it, or no sprays, is absolutely wonderful. And I completely support it in that sense. Anything that pushes us further is important. But, you know, Rich, the thing about powdery mildew, if you think about it, in the United States, there has been, well, we'd have to check with Davis probably, or Cornell, but there's been research into powdery mildew going back to at least the 50s or 40s, I would think. And so there's, again, a really childlike question you can ask yourself, which is, how can so much human intellect be bent for such a long period of time on a problem and not have solved it? Clearly, we're not asking the right questions. If we were asking the right questions, we would have found the answer. Maybe the right question is get rid of Vitis vinifera in the United States. That's fine. If that's the answer, that's the answer. That's okay. But clearly, we've been asking the wrong questions. And of course, some of this goes back to the fact that all of this research is funded by the chemical companies. This is not some lefty proclamation. This is the reality of the way funding happens in agriculture in the United States. And so, of course, they're going to look for a fungicidal answer. They're not going to be interested in something else. That's not how they make money.
So looking back for yourself at the evolution of Littorai from then to now, tell me about sort of the biggest milestones in your mind. What are the biggest sort of accomplishments or achievements, things you're proudest of, or things that you maybe didn't think you'd ever get to that as you look back?
For a long time, Heidi and I lived on Vineyard Avenue in St. Helena before we bought the pivot here in west of Sebastopol, between Sebastopol and Freestone. And when we were thinking about where we would set up camp, I would drive east towards Highway 29. And I said to myself, whatever the decision is, I'm either going to turn left at 29 or I'm going to turn right, but I'm never going to do both. And what I meant by that, Rich, was from a organizational and a personal point of view. If we were going to do the North Coast or even Oregon, that was turning left, right? If we were going to do Carneros or Santa Cruz or Santa Maria, that would be turning right, but we would never mix those two. Because my feeling remains to this day that the greatest challenge in the wine business is maintaining the intimacy between the wine grower and the place. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Burgundy or in Oregon or in California or in Chile. We all have these things pulling us in all different directions. And if you're too geographically dispersed, you lose that intimacy of connection to place. And so I had multiple opportunities during and after working with Archery Summit to buy fruit in Oregon. And I, as you know, I love Oregon, but that's just not what we do. And it was a form of self-discipline to say, no, that's just not what we do. Other people can do that. You know, Patty Green can come by down and buy Hirsch. That's awesome. But that's not what Littorai is going to do. We need to focus on our little part of the world and maintaining as much intimacy with our part of the world as we can. And if that means that we never buy fruit from some amazing sites in the Santa Cruz Mountains, because they're amazing sites, it's okay. That's life. It's just fine.
I like that notion of intimacy with place. How long does it take you to feel, how long did it take you to feel that about the various places, especially your kind of home base there? How long to understand the place? How long to learn to kind of to love it or to understand it at that level?
I don't know. I think you learn, you always learn, right? You never stop learning. I think your predictive abilities get better as you've seen a wider and wider range of vintages and climatological conditions. So I think that, you know, that's helpful. I would hesitate to put a number on it. I will say, and I don't know why what you just said makes me think of this, I never understood the subtlety of vintage until I came to California. Now that might seem like a counterintuitive statement, but what I mean by that is that in Northern Europe, particularly, even more so than Oregon, although I would say the Oregon of the 70s and 80s before climate change had more of this, but in Northern Europe, the differences from one year to another really hit you over the head, right? Like it rained 2 inches in the 10 days before harvest. What more do you need to know, right? Well, actually, you do need to know a lot more than that. Or, you know, there was terrible bud set, you know, fruit set because of rain during harvest or whatever. I mean, during flowering, whatever it might be. But the reality is that vintage is far more subtle than that. And it depends on things that we don't really think about. First of all, they're perennial plants. So the prior year has far more influence on what the fruit is like the next year than any of us ever talk about. And when you work in California and you work in a summer dry climate and you see these extraordinary differences in vintages, and of course everybody says, yeah, it's, you know, it's summer dry climate, the wines are more consistent. Of course they are, but there's no question that there's dramatic differences in fruit profile and quality from one vintage to another, or characteristics from one vintage to another. And seeing the degree of variation when you have a summer dry climate is really extraordinary. And I think Oregon experiences that too, for sure, that you think too easily about the things that hit you over the head, like the 2 inches of rain, and you don't think as much about all these other little things that may actually have cumulatively had a bigger impact.
It's really interesting. I like that insight. It's an interesting way to look at it. I want to back up for a second. You mentioned New Zealand, obviously a big part of your work at Burn Cottage in New Zealand. Tell me how that came about and sort of the role you've played there.
Yeah, so this was friends who own distributorships in the United States who were interested in investing in New Zealand. And the short story was that they asked me to come down and look at this piece of property that they had purchased on the fly. And I said, yes. This was the Sauvage family. And I said, yeah, I'm happy to go down and look. And they didn't know that I had a lot of very dear friends in Central Otago at that time. Just by circumstance, you know, Steve Davies, who was owns Doctor's Flat, had lived with us for a year in St. Helena. Blair Walter, who's the winemaker at Felton Road, had spent his first few weeks sleeping on our couch when he came to work at Newton in Napa Valley. Grant Taylor, I had met with Gary Andrus in '83 when Grant was his winemaker at at Pine Ridge, and I can go on from there. A whole bunch of people. So I actually knew people in Central Otago very well. I'd never been to Central, but it was not like dropping in with no help. And so all those people were hugely helpful in us getting started. And it was a lot of fun. It's a different climate. It's very different from both California and Oregon. It's a desert, but it does rain throughout the year. And there are years in Central when you do get, an inch of rain in mid-growing season. And there are years when you can have, green, actively growing cover crops throughout the year, or the summer, which you don't get at least in California, and certainly you don't see as much lushness in Oregon and some of the dry months, depending on what the rainfall has been like. So it's a different world with very different light intensity. Quite far north or south in this case, as you know, but really a lot of fun to work in. And it was a place when I went down there where the big ripe school was very much dominant. So there was all this talk about, a cool climate and all that, which I think some of that has been true in Oregon also, where there's been more talk about cool climate than actual cool climate winemaking, where the wines are bigger and richer and riper than people really want to admit. And Central certainly was suffering from some of that, I think, at the time. And we really, again, set out with a very different course. We wanted to make wines that were much lower in alcohol. We felt like we could keep the acidity that way and that the wines would be ripe, but we got a lot of flack from the locals for a while on that. But that started to change over time. I think the basic picking parameters have moved much lower or less ripe on the sugar scale, at least, than they were in the early 2000s when we started.
So I want to kind of zoom out a little bit. Obviously, you have a pretty unique perspective on the Oregon wine industry, a unique perspective that we don't get to share very often. So tell me about you mentioned your initial impressions of Oregon and the wines and the people here. Tell me from what you've seen change and from your perspective, what Oregon wine looks like today in 2022.
Sure. And, it's important to say, Rich, that I'm an outsider. And so I don't have a really good sense of perspective today, the way I might have in the mid 90s. But I'm very interested in a lot of the producers that didn't exist, obviously, when I was working in Oregon and tasting those wines and following them. I think clearly the biggest single thing is the change in Chardonnay quality. There's no question about that. And that was predictable. It was not part of the mission at Archery Summit. I think in some ways it should have been, but then Pine Ridge was producing Chardonnay, right? So that may have been another reason that Gary didn't want to do it. I don't recall at the time, but I always felt that opportunity was there. And I think it was partly that it was just a poor stepchild, much like Pinot Gris, right? I mean, Pinot Gris was a wine you chucked in tanks because you could bottle it early and get it out the door. And I think to a large extent now acknowledged by many people who are making terrific Chardonnay now that maybe weren't back then, was between plant material and time and effort, it just wasn't a focus. And I think that's dramatically different today. And the quality leaps are really exciting and really, really fun for me. It's really fun as an outsider to watch that. So that really sticks out. I think that there's a lot more sophistication viticulturally, and there's more complexity viticulturally in terms of both rootstocks and clones and all those things. I think we all tend to exaggerate our own progress in the sense that the bottom line is that Mother Nature has the steering wheel. And she doesn't care whether you think you're the most sophisticated grape grower in the world and whether you've planted your vineyard to the most super fantastic clones and soil you can possibly imagine. When Mother Nature decides it's a great vintage, it doesn't matter whether it's 1982 or 2022. She decides that. And So I think all of us tend to exaggerate our progress, and it's a natural aspect of needing to sell a product where you have inventory. So I want to, emphasize that matters, and that progress isn't always as linear as we think it is. We may be better at dealing with different things that we weren't 10 or 20 years ago. Maybe Oregon's better at dealing with warmer vintages than it would have been. I would never, ever deny that. So is Burgundy better at dealing with warmer vintages. But I don't know that our progress is as linear as we like to think. I think the variety progress is very clear. I think that the market understanding of Oregon is much better, and that there's a much greater appreciation. I think that Oregon is going to be challenged by growth, right? That the amount of growth is challenged today and will continue to be a challenge. It isn't the small community that it was. And so holding together, holding on to the sense of community is going to be really important. And trying to foster it in the face of growth will be a challenge.
Curious, again, from your perspective, for obviously a place closer to you, tell me about the growth of Sonoma in the time you've been there. Obviously, from a relatively unknown to what it is now. What are the biggest changes you've seen there, and what is your kind of perception of those changes?
Yeah, I think that it's always fun to, and I haven't looked at these statistics lately, but Sonoma County alone had more Pinot Noir planted than all of Oregon, at least up until really recently, and may still. My apologies to anybody who has that number on the tip of their tongue, but that puts things in a certain perspective, right? That Oregon remains very small. That is changing rapidly because there's really no more land to plant in the Russian River Valley, and so that's going to dramatically shift over the coming years. The Sonoma Coast is tiny. I mean, there's approximately 1,000 acres planted in the West Sonoma Coast AVA that was just approved. So, if the Russian River Valley is huge and Oregon is medium-sized, we're the tip of the tail on the rat, so to speak, in terms of volume. And it means that we have to have a really thoughtful, humble awareness of where we stand in the world of wine. We're not going to be Oregon. We don't have the power. We never will. We're never going to be the Russian River either, for the same reasons, even more so. And so we have to approach our position in the wine world being very much aware of that, and that we'll never reach that critical mass that I think Oregon has now reached, right? It's just not going to happen here. It's not possible because of planning restrictions, forests, viable land, all those things.
That's really interesting to hear, because it feels so backwards from what we generally hear. Oregon, California, size comparison. It's very interesting to hear of Oregon as being larger than something.
Yes, it is, and most Oregonians are not aware of that, and that's been a very interesting thing. Is as the Sonoma Coast and Anderson Valley have developed, that reality that people in Oregon don't know this, that they think of big California, and yet we really are tiny compared to both the Russian River and Oregon, and have to be aware of it and figure out how to find a way in the marketplace despite that.
So I'm curious, your look ahead for the future, both for the North Sonoma Coast, for Oregon, American Western wine in particular. What's coming down the road for the wine industry? What are you excited about? Is there anything that you're particularly concerned about?
Climate change, for sure, is something we should all be concerned about. It's going to affect water dramatically. It already is. We all know that. It's affecting the composition of the forests and the forest fires that we're all going to face, which are the reality that everybody's going to face now, from San Diego to to Vancouver and beyond. So that is a grave concern to me. I think that in terms of varieties, we've all got to be open, and which is a real adjustment, I think, for the fathers of the Willamette Valley, where everything was centered around Pinot Noir. And I know it's a discussion, of course, in the community now, but I really encourage everybody to be forward thinking about that. I don't think that planting Syrah on the right site in the Willamette Valley makes you a trader, by any means. Or any other minor variety which people are experimenting with and doing great things with. I think that that's the reality that we've all got to face, and I encourage everybody to really be actively engaged with it, including changing trellis systems, etc. And nobody knows where we're going, so nobody knows what the answers are going to be. I think there's a great question for all of us in the world of Pinot Noir of what does this variety become in a warmer climate? What is its ability to adapt? Does it have more ability to adapt than we realize? Will the wines become profoundly different in the way they age because the climate is warmer? I don't think anybody knows really. We know that there have been great vintages in Burgundy which were very hot and very dry, and people celebrated them for years. So we actually do have some experience about that. We also know interesting things about it, such as the fact that the length of day is much longer in Burgundy or Oregon in midsummer than it is in California. So the way that climate change is going to play in each region is going to be distinct, but with this overarching theme of the challenges ahead. Yeah, that really sticks out to me.
It's been interesting for us. Climate change, of course, has been a topic of conversation from the beginning of these interviews, but water only recently has become a major part. It's been interesting to see the switch flip on in a place like the Willamette Valley, where water never seems like it should be an issue, for it suddenly to be an issue people are thinking about.
Yeah, and I mean that you could say the same for the Sonoma Coast. I mean, Cazadero had an average rainfall per year of 80 or 90 inches. So it was the same situation in which people really didn't expect to have to face these issues. And Cazadero may be one of the last places that will be okay, because you could have 90 inches and still have a lot of water, at least in terms of rainfall. But yeah, these are major considerations. They're going to affect how we think about irrigation. And I really encourage people to think about managing irrigation. And there's been plenty of dry farming in the Willamette Valley, but it'll become more challenging, right? As we get into a drier climate. That doesn't mean you can't do it. You just have to think about soils and soil composition and cover crops in a whole different way. And so I don't think it's goodbye to dry farming for Oregon by any means. I think it's just a matter of, it's going to be vintage dependent, obviously, but it's going to really depend on, you're really going to be looking at trying to manage stress, right, in the second half of the year. That's what I think.
So what about as you look ahead for yourself? What comes next for you? What comes next for Littorai? And is there anything you're looking forward to or planning to experiment with, or anything coming down the pipe?
Yeah, so certainly the variety thing, we'll experiment with both whites and reds. I don't have a whole lot more to say about that now. We've already begun trellis experiments, some relatively dramatically different, to try to address the question of, heat and shading on the vines. So those things are already in process. We'll buy some more land for sure at some point, and we'll plant some more. I think in America, we suffer from this disease of thinking that you always need to grow, right? And we haven't grown in production in Littorai since the mid 2000s, or 2007, 2008. And there's a lot of other ways to grow, Rich, and I really encourage all of us in the wine business to think about growth in a different way, because the really successful wine businesses are not necessarily those that are growing in case volume. If that's what you want to be, and you're a world conqueror and you're out to become the next, greatest big wine mogul, good for you. Go do that by that kind of growth. But there's a lot of other ways to grow in the wine business, and we have a long, long way to go in the States to get there compared to some of our friends in Burgundy who have multi-generational senses of, growth without becoming larger.
All right. Well, I could talk to you all day, but that is all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't talk about that you wanted to cover?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered everything that comes to mind. Yeah, I think I'm good.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate the background chorus of animals as well that was kind of coming through. That was excellent. And a welcome addition to you.
We staged that for you.
That's just piped in.
I do that every time we have an interview or talk to a media. I turn on the piped in sheet. They're right below us and right below the winery right now. And they love to set up a racket.
Sure.
I'm happy to say they have a lot of offspring up at Christum right now. So there's a whole, I think Dan told me they were up to 50 or 70 sheep at this point. I can't remember.
Yeah, I went out and saw him before 2021 harvest, and there was a lot more than he had said when we first met him. So they're propagating rapidly, as you would hope.
Yeah, and they're good at that.
Thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your stories with us and for chatting. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but if you want to hang around for a second, and my students might have a question or two for you, we'll see before you go.